Good morning. I'm going to sort of take the talk in a somewhat different direction, or the talks here. It may get a little geeky, but, well, that's too bad. I have to say that, while I did have this job as president, more important to my life has been that I learned to code at age 13, which was 49 years ago. 44, yeah, something like that. Anyway, so this has been always more interesting to me than all the other stuff, but then, of course, being the child of refugees, the whole sort of commie thing was forced upon me, and I've always hated them. But I... Well, it just comes, and then somewhere I got really interested in democracy, which I guess grew out of the not liking the commie thing. And all of this came together. I mean, these three separate strands in my life, which was sort of computers, IT, commies, and democracy, with the election in the United States of 2016. And as it turned out, in a number of other elections. But at that point, I started looking at what is going on, and basically what I figured out is that that democracies in the digital era are under attack from 6 or 7 vectors, which we can, I don't use these things usually, but wait, in the back, yeah. And I'll go through them briefly and then talk about what we can do about it. First of all, there's hacking, and that is, I mean, you hear people talking about hacking the elections. Actually, that's, as a metaphor, perhaps it's okay, but hacking that is breaking into other people's computers without their knowing about it, or is something that has been going on for about 30, 40 years. And you can say that just about everybody does it. So, but it is the basis of what has been used to actually attack democracies. First and foremost, by something called doxing, which is publishing documents. The first real case of doxing, where the term came from, was when Chelsea, or whatever her name was before, Manning, published or released State Department files, and we got the term doxing. But it became a political weapon in democracies or democratic elections for the first time with the hacking into the DNC server in 2015, 2016, and then having Hillary Clinton's emails published, which of course we know had a huge effect on the election. FBI Director Comey, in fact, said that the RNC, or the Republican National Committee, had also been hacked into by the same people, but they were not doxed. And so here you see one way of manipulating elections that would not have been possible before. Recall in 1972, a group of people broke into the DNC again in the Watergate scandal, but there's not much they could have done. I mean, they're going to start carting out, big file cabinets of documents. That wouldn't have really worked too well, but in the digital era, you can just steal these things. This is not something unique to this turned out not to be unique to the US election. It was also used by the same people against Emmanuel Macron, the person who was ultimately elected president of France. It was clear that Russia, in that case, was involved both in the hacking, but also in supporting the other candidate, hard right, nationalist, xenophobic Front National candidate, Marine Le Pen. The French, however, I guess having learned from, or rather Macron's team having learned from the DNC case, actually was very clever and put really fake items into their server. So when, and there were the most egregious kinds of things you could commit. And so these were doxed, but they were so obviously fake that they managed to negate this. But nonetheless, doxing has become something that in democracies people fear, because everyone has something awful in their emails that you wouldn't want the world to see, something embarrassing. and this has become a political tool as a result of being in the digital era. Of course, what has gotten the most treatment in discussions of election manipulations are fake news, but actually what is interesting is the way the social media has been instrumentalized in a way to spread fake news. So BuzzFeed did a study already after the US elections, which showed that on Facebook, 7.4 million true stories were shared. Unfortunately, 8.7 million, or 1.3 million more, fake stories were shared. So you had real stories got less coverage. This is actually last week in Science magazine. There was there were 2 articles showing how well fake news does spread faster, which is kind of understandable since it's much clickbaitier, and so people tend to share strange things. Now, the issue again with fake news is not so much that it's fake, that we can. But the fact that it is actually maliciously created and spread, as we saw with during the US election, and we saw most recently with the Czech elections. You just make stuff up, use Twitter, use Facebook, and much of this has come out of the so-called Internet Research Agency in Petersburg, which is also known as the Big Troll Factory. We see, especially in the case of Twitter, bots or roboticized accounts repeating the same thing under different names over and over and over again. In the case of one Twitter hashtag, Syria hoax, which appeared magically about half an hour after news came of the sarin attack in Syria, which of course would cause an uproar in the West. But the Twitter bots were put to tweet under the hashtag Syria hoax at a rate of once every 5 seconds, as it was measured by one researcher. On top of that, we see social media being used, again, something purely possible in the digital era, where the Internet Research Agency set up a Facebook group of white nationalists, and then they set up another Facebook group of blacktivists, as they call themselves, and they called for a demonstration at the same time, at the same place in Texas. Now, there have been other cases of this too, but this has received the most coverage. Clearly, there was a hope to create some kind of clash. It didn't happen, fortunately, but nonetheless, this is one more way that Russia has been manipulating elections, hoping to sow chaos and other sort of perhaps even nastier things. Moving on, we have now algorithms that process big data to target voters. You can, in fact, target, if you would like, any kind of group that you would like if you set the criteria for naming them or for honing in on them on Facebook. The Russians clearly did this. Of course, so did the Trump campaign, so have other campaigns done the same thing. But in the case of Russia, they actually use this feature of Facebook. Combine with this, you combine this with so-called dark ads, in which you show an ad which is only seen by the people that you have targeted via these algorithms. And so you can give one message, as happened in the US election, to a black woman living in Minnesota, which talks about Hillary's statements about black people, and then you target another group, which is an Arizona rancher, and play on his fears of Mexicans coming in. I mean, this was an experiment by 2 journalists, was carried to an extreme recently, just to see how much you could get away with, and they wanted to see if you could buy ads targeting Nazis in the United States, and they sort of set a number of criteria, hates Jews, hates blacks, and lo and behold, you could on Facebook target 3,400 people who fit the the These are all new to the way we do democracy. This did not exist before social media and the power of algorithms. And it has been most effectively used by the Russian Federation. And then one last thing that has been identified that the Russians did was that, depending on who you ask, the DHS said that 21 states had their voter rolls hacked into or breached. The oddly named Reality Winner, who took an NSA document which claimed, or posted it, which claimed that 39 states had their voter rolls breached. Now, already we don't know, or at least we haven't been told publicly of anything being changed, but even the act of having a voter roll, of having voter rolls breached already causes a good deal of apprehension. The legitimacy of the election is called into question merely by the fact that it has been breached. And so what we see today, most actively on the part of the Russians, but others can do this too, and as I mentioned some cases of it, that the way we do democracy is under threat. And this is not only here, this is basically throughout the democratic world in elections. We could probably go back to the Brexit referendum. The word is not clear, and of course the British Parliament is not that keen on investigating this, but there seems to have been some Russian participation in that. So too probably with the Netherlands referendum on the association agreement with, oh shit, I have no time. All right, let me go quickly. Excuse me for that. Basically, we have seen some form or another of what I enumerated here in Germany, France, the UK, not only the United States, Spain, Mexico. McMaster warned us recently that Mexico, the Russians were trying to do something. The Netherlands, in Czechia most recently, and in other countries. Governments, parliaments, political parties in Germany have also think tanks, so their think tanks have been hacked. Even international organizations such as WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, has been hacked and doxed. And these have been done by two groups, APT 28 and 29, also Advanced Persistent Threat 28 and 29, also known as Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear. And so when we look at this, we see this massive attack on democracy using digital means. The problem we face is that, and these are just some of the, I colored in, these are the ones we know. The ones that are, there are probably other ones as well, and I don't know how you put WADA up there. I should have put South Korea or something. In any case, the problem is our responses have remained national. And so there is no coordination. Cyber warfare, however, of this type in attacking democracies, or even the more sort of mundane form of hacking your electrical grids, has made traditional concepts of conflict irrelevant. Digital threats do not recognize distance. Everyone is equally vulnerable to attack, regardless of borders or physical distance. And this is completely new. Began with hacks into things like electrical systems, but now we see this being applied to democracies. From St. Petersburg, you can disrupt democracy or democratic elections, and even in between elections by spreading rumors, just the life of democracies. I would say that what we do need in response to this is some form of a cyber NATO. And not a NATO as in North Atlantic, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is regionally based, precisely because of old forms of warfare being kinetic. It's North Atlantic because it's a function of tank logistics columns, fighter jet range, bomber range. But this stuff, what we're seeing now, distance is irrelevant. And so what we do need is to actually take up an idea promoted more or less at the same time, about 20 years ago, both by John McCain and under a different name by Madeleine Albright, of a community of democracies, a league of democracies, that in fact can cooperate on defending democracy. The reason why you need something like this is that the threats to democracy in this sense are asymmetric. The methods used against democracies have no effect against an authoritarian regime that is pursuing these policies. I mean, does anyone actually think that Putin will not be elected? And so, I mean, we can't do to them what they do to us. The whole concept of reciprocity, this underlying security thinking ever since the first pre-hominid threw a rock at another pre-hominid, which was a kinetic attack, I mean, we can't do that to them. I mean, we're not going to disrupt their non-democracy in this way. I mean, maybe you could publish some of some of the data that we saw from Anders here. We could publish this. Whether it does much, we don't know. Certainly Navalny has not had a huge effect in doxing the corrupt practices of the Russian regime. And so, to close up, I'm way over time, sorry, but mea culpa. We have to use our asymmetric advantages, and this, I hope this is a recurring theme here, and Anders already alluded to it before, is that we have to use what are our asymmetric advantages. What are they? Visas need to be dramatically better vetted than they are. I was personally insulted when I found out the same week that Sergei Lavrov went on another sort of tirade against Western democracy and the Enlightenment, and I found out that his daughter, Ms. Lavrova, had been attending or graduated in my university, Columbia, which is kind of like the most Enlightenment-centered education you can get in the U.S. I'm saying, so your daughter is going to Barnard or Columbia, and you're like railing against the decadent West. It doesn't work. So we need to really keep people like that out. I just saw a whole list on Facebook of all the children of all these people who are living in the West, and I mean, throw them out. I mean, and unfortunately that may go, no. I mean, why? And then the other thing is they really do need the West. This is our best security guarantee these days, is that they need all these regimes, not only the Russian, but other corrupt regimes and authoritarian regimes, need the West because the West has rule of law. And if you have rule of law, that means your money, your property is safe. So what you have to do is tighten up the rules that allow them to launder their money here and buy property. I mean, the first thing, which again, Anders alluded to, and I hope this becomes a recurring theme until someone does something about it, is that you cannot buy, that it should be illegal for a shell company to buy property. I mean, my country, Estonia, no, it's not an applause. In my country, because of where we're located and because of our rather obvious anxiety about it, it's the, I don't know where I was. Anyway, that the uppermost little red spot there, that's my country. But because of where we're located, we do have rules that you have to physically show up for a transfer of property. We have to know who you are. And I think rules like that need to be implemented in order to deal with the threat that we currently have. Whether this will be done, it's up to the governments that are still democratically elected. We hope that that happens. That was just kind of my summing up there. I won't take any more of your time, but that's what we need. And I would say this is for David Kramer, the Freedom House list of democratic countries. The countries in green are the ones that should be getting together to create some kind of organization to safeguard their elections. And just on a final note, I forgot to mention on the topic of the axis of weasels, during the During the conflict, or the sort of political battle between Catalonia and Madrid, it turns out that either, again, two different studies, 85% or 97% of the inflammatory social media content was done by the Russians together with Venezuela, because Russia doesn't Russia, I mean, you've seen the quality of some of these Russian tweets, is good to be American Trump supporter, but I mean, they have even fewer people who can do good Spanish. And so, in fact, what do? They actually work together with the Venezuela regime that actually has a long history of meddling in the affairs of democratic countries in Latin America. So we have to get ourselves together on these issues. And with that, I think anyway, whatever. I never use these things. Thank you very much. Bye.
Yeah, James, and let me ask you the same position establishing question.
Yeah, well, Harvey Fierstein, who's a very famous American playwright and actor, he said that being silent in the face of evil is something that we can't do. And so, being here on a Kremlin-funded propaganda network, I'm going to wear my gay pride suspenders and I'm going to speak out against the horrific anti-gay legislation that Vladimir Putin has signed into law, that was passed unanimously by the Russian Duma, that criminalizes homosexual propaganda, that effectively makes it illegal to talk about homosexuality in public. We've seen a spate of violent attacks on gay people in Russia.
Of course, we'll discuss it later, but what about Bradley Manning first?
I'm not really interested in talking about Bradley Manning. I'm interested in talking about the horrific environment of homophobia in Russia right now, and to let the Russian gay people know that they have friends and allies in solidarity from people all over the world, and that we're not going to be silent in the face of this horrific repression that is perpetrated by your paymasters, by Vladimir Putin.
Oh, I see.
That's what I'm here to talk about.
All right.
Yes, that's what I'm here to talk about. And I don't know how, as a journalist, how you can go to sleep at night. It's seeing what happens to journalists in Russia who are routinely harassed, tortured, in some cases killed by the Russian government.
James, you
how
have to
you
come
can call
over
yourself a journalist and how you can... Thank you. Well, that's a tough act to follow. In October of 1989, there was a young KGB officer stationed in Dresden, the country once known as the German Democratic Republic. And there were, for many months, protests going on against this country, which was neither German nor democratic nor a republic. It was actually a East German Soviet puppet state. And this young KGB officer, his job was to protect it from its domestic enemies. And the crowds were getting larger and larger, and he called the nearby Soviet military base, and he asked them for assistance. And he was told, Moscow is silent. Now, this young KGB officer, a lieutenant, he went on to do much bigger and better things. In just 11 years, he became president of the Russian Federation. And basically, his entire tenure over the past 18 years is to ensure that Moscow is never silent again when any of its neighbors or the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, the nations that it used to dominate, whenever those countries display any form of independence. And so in 2007, here at the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin gave a virulently anti-Western speech in which he declared that political solutions to world problems are over. The following year, he made good on that promise by invading the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, a country whose territory Russia continues to occupy, 20% of that country's territory. In fact, a year before that, in Estonia, shortly after it joined the EU and NATO, a series of cyber attacks were perpetrated against this tiny former Soviet republic. And then, of course, in 2014, in Ukraine, when Ukrainians wanted to demonstrate their support for joining a trade agreement with the European Union, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, the first violent seizure of territory on the European continent since World War II, and it continues to fight a war in eastern Ukraine where some 10,000 people have died. So as Europe's political stability, its social cohesion, its economic prosperity and security are a greater threat than at any point since the Cold War, Vladimir Putin is destabilizing the continent from within and from without. He's threatening it through supporting subversive political movements within European countries, and externally, he's threatening the NATO alliance with a massive military buildup, constant intimidation of NATO allies, and attempts to weaken, if not destroy, the transatlantic link with the United States. Over the past 18 years that Vladimir Putin has been ruling Russia, defense spending has increased 20-fold. We are hearing increasingly confrontational rhetoric. 3 years ago, standing next to a clearly shocked German Chancellor Angela Merkel, Vladimir Putin defended the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was the infamous agreement that basically divided Eastern Europe between the two totalitarian powers, and that started World War II. And we're also been hearing over the past several years incredibly loose talk about using nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons have become a more important part of Russia's strategic doctrine. And Russian military exercises often end with simulated nuclear attacks on NATO allies. Now, unlike during the Cold War, Russia isn't trying to occupy Europe with the Red Army and spreading communist ideology. What it is trying to do is to create a sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's trying to do that by overturning the continent's security order, which has kept peace on the European continent for the past 70 years. And this is an order that allows disputes to be settled through negotiation, through dialogue, through talking, through treaties and whatnot. The Russians want to replace that order with one that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov refers to as a post-Western world order. And what he basically means is an order where might makes right. And to accomplish this order, the Kremlin cheats, basically, and it cheats on everything. It cheats in sports, and it cheats on borders, which it doesn't respect. It cheats in elections, its own, in trying to tamper in the elections of democratic countries. And it is trying to achieve in Europe and in America, non-violently, what it achieved in Eastern Europe through violence, which is basically replacing liberal democratic governments with ones that no longer stand for the liberal democratic values on which the Western alliance is maintained, and will basically make their deals with Moscow and let Russia have its sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe. Because a West that is divided, that is inert, that is unsure of its own values and what it stands for, that will not stand up to Russian aggression. Now, befitting a judo master, which he is, Vladimir Putin is pushing on open doors across the West. He's exploiting fears over Islam and immigration and globalization and economic stagnation. And shorn of any sort of Marxist ideology, the Russians are able to use a much more diverse set of tools in their attempts to interfere in the West. They have covert means like the troll factory in St. Petersburg that you've all been reading a lot about, thanks to Special Counselor Mueller. And there are overt means, which is basically giving money to political parties that are anti-NATO, anti-American, and pro-Russian. Here is Marine Le Pen, the leader of the French National Front, which received a €9 million loan from a Russian bank several years ago. And because it's no longer communist, because it's no longer Marxist-Leninist, the Putin regime is able to make alliances with all sorts of people across the political spectrum. It's no longer communists and their fellow travelers, but in fact, many people on the right. We have the free market fundamentalist former president of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus. We have the right-wing nationalist Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, standing alongside the neo-Marxists in the Greek Syriza party. And who could forget the former German Social Democratic Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who said that Vladimir Putin is an impeccable Democrat, and who now works as a lobbyist for Gazprom, a very handsomely remunerated one at that. We also have the disinformation networks, the propaganda networks, which I appeared on once and strangely have not been invited back. Here you see Sputnik, where all sorts of disinformation, fake news, lies. The people who go on these programs are often fringe figures, conspiracy theorists, Holocaust deniers, a real wonderful group of people. Around the world, Vladimir Putin is basically waging a war on democracy and human rights. In Syria, the Russians have been crucial in supporting the genocidal Assad regime. In Venezuela, the Russians have been investing heavily in support of the Maduro government, which has brought upon an economic crisis which is worse in absolute terms than the Great Depression. And in Cuba, they're back to their old ways, supporting the Castro regime. Now, from election meddling to its targeted assassinations like we just saw last week, Vladimir Putin behaves with implausible deniability. And yet, despite the fact that this deniability is so implausible, he can always count on sycophants in the West to defend what he and his government is doing. No matter how malevolent or brazen or murderous, there are so many people throughout the Western world, in our democratic countries, who will make excuses for it and who will say, we need to have more dialogue. We need to have a reset. We need to try to understand what the Russians want better. We need to apologize for having enlarged NATO. The excuses go on and on and on. And what happens? The Russians, under Vladimir Putin, just keep on behaving with more and more audacity. To paraphrase Leon Trotsky, we may not be seeking conflict with Russia, or with Vladimir Putin, I should say. But Vladimir Putin is clearly seeking conflict with us. A genuinely democratic Russia would have nothing to fear from the West, and it would therefore stop trying to disrupt and debase us. But as long as Russia is the regime that it is, as long as Vladimir Putin is ruling this country, and as long as Vladimir Putin cannot live alongside a democratic world cannot live alongside Vladimir Putin's Russia. Thank you very much.
Hi. So I've gotten the fun task today of discussing the future of Russian hybrid warfare. And I guess that that means that first we have to accept that Russia uses hybrid means to achieve political, economic, and military objectives. Lately, there's been a particularly nonsensical debate happening about whether or not Gerasimov is doctrine. So I put it up just because. But I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this because, frankly, every major Western intelligence service and military, including NATO, Estonia, Lithuania, Sweden, Finland, the US, the UK, have assessed the need to better identify and combat hybrid tactics because of Russia. Just yesterday, General Scaparrotti, the EUCOM commander, was testifying in the House of Representatives and was asked about Gerasimov, and his response was, Russia has a doctrine that sees these activities below the level of conflict as part of a full spectrum, and with the intent that they can undermine a country using these means without ever needing to use military force. That's their objective. I think that's pretty clear. So Gerasimov exists not because it's doctrine or not, and not because General Gerasimov has been remarkably consistent over time about the concepts that he represents on hybrid warfare, but because hybrid warfare makes sense for Russia. This total guerrilla-style warfare is an equalizer between the Kremlin and the West, focusing an economy of resources on a far stronger opponent in order to erode our will to fight and to erode our psychological defenses. The strength of this system, like any good guerrilla campaign, is not in its integration, but more than anything in that it is deniable, which Jamie was just talking about in his presentation. It focuses on the aspect of every system that Putin views as the weakest and the most corruptible, which is people. There's an inherent conflict between the Russian intelligence services and security state and the military and defense establishment about hybrid warfare. The latter believes that hybrid tactics are a prelude to physical warfare, and the former believes that, done right, hybrid tactics will replace physical warfare. I think the MOD view remains that hybrid warfare hasn't been particularly good at delivering on military objectives, and they want to renew focus on the use of military tools, so less hybrid, more actual warfare. But this is reflected in the updated Russian nuclear doctrine, their expanded global force posture. But the intelligence services are right that hybrid warfare has been a more effective means of delivering on Russia's political objectives. So looking ahead at what the future of Russian hybrid warfare will be, I think we need to focus on a couple of core questions. First, will hybrid warfare remain a preferred means of war, or will actual war be ascendant? Essentially, will military objectives overtake political ones? And then, what is the future of the hybrid domain? And what is the future of regular warfare? Essentially, what is the war that Russia thinks it can win? And I think that's the case. The Kremlin will fight the war that it can win. In both the shadow wars and the real wars, the Kremlin has come to rely on core aspects of hybrid doctrine, on deniability, on informality, and on adaptability, and the use of proxies and green men and Wagner and troll farms and patriotic hackers and everything else. The proliferation of these informal assets and deniable actors and proxies will continue over time. And at this level, at the deniable level, the Kremlin's strength doesn't come from the power vertical, it comes from risk-taking. This is a somewhat counterintuitive evaluation of Putin and his threshold of caution, but nonetheless, I think it represents the pattern of behavior that we've seen from the Kremlin across the West and beyond. So the future of real war is probably too much to go into right now, but I think the Kremlin will press ahead in sort of a four-pronged approach, first focusing on the use of the special forces-based model for its military, relying on mercenaries and contractors and proxies for most of its actual war fighting as much as possible, continuing to develop and test and deploy their new generations of weapon systems, and to expand their global force posture, and finally to complete the full integration of SIGINT and EW, so what we call electronic warfare, but what the Russians refer to as radio-electronic combat, into the way they fight. So that's jamming and spoofing, disruption, confusing GPS, knocking down drones, all of the things that have been discussed a bit in the context of Ukraine, but which are developing much faster. For fun, you can also throw in robot guns and AI-driven everything, the increasing use by Russia of chemical weapons agents, and their belief that nuclear weapons are now tools of conventional warfare. It all sounds like a lot of fun, I know. I think we're all looking forward to this. But beyond these capabilities, how will the real war be used by Russia? I think the compounding military skepticism of hybrid warfare in Russia is something that we need to be aware of. And I think it's worrying for a number of reasons. Primarily, this is because Russians are not that good at gauging the red lines of their opponents, and particularly when we're not very good at communicating what those red lines actually are. The potential for escalation is increasing because of the elevated risk-taking of Russian forces, particularly along the border of NATO and in the Middle East and beyond. I think Russia will continue to experiment with what they can trigger without Russians being involved, maintaining that level of deniability. But they're not as careful as they once were in preserving this, because essentially I think they're so used to us not responding that they no longer give a shit about any of it. The use of Novichok on Sergei Skripal, I think, is a really good example of that kind of mindset. But if that's the future of the Russian battlefield, so what's the future of hybrid warfare? I think the Kremlin wants to influence political decision-making without having to exert any expensive governance in a lot of places. It wants to show that democracy is just as corrupt as Putinism. It wants to set the terms for the system that will replace the rules-based post-World War II international system that Jamie described so well. For these objectives, political warfare is key, and that means increasing reliance on hybrid means. The Kremlin will fight wars that they can win, and that means fighting wars with the FSB and the SVR and the GRU, and a range of proxies and informal assets. We can be sure that they'll continue doing this because the chessboard in the West looks like garbage right now. And the Russian hybrid warfare campaigns, using propaganda and information operations, soft power, economic leverage, expanding and aggressive intelligence operations, old school espionage, cyber attacks, and more, have been contributing factors to these political shifts in a number of places. The goal has been and remains to totally alter our perceptions of ourselves. So what tools do they use now, and what might those look like moving forward? On disinformation, on the Kremlin's smoke and mirrors, this has been a primary line of effort. Leaving aside that disinformation is about rewriting history, changing identity, changing perception, radicalization, and atomization, what is disinformation beyond information? And I think the future of disinformation really looks more at data pollution. When there's too much information for us to process, we're relying on algorithms and on machine learning to curate data for us. And the ability to pollute the data being used in all those systems will be a critical capability to develop. So far, there's very little evidence that machines will be any less crap than people at telling the difference between truth and disinformation. And if algorithms are deciding who gets a job or a mortgage or who we bomb or what fire to put out or where the traffic needs to go, the information going into making those decisions matters a lot. And the ability to sculpt that information and to skew it in different ways to determine the outcome of those decisions can help you game financial markets or corporate earnings. It can help you dox the data footprint of an individual or a corporation or an organization. You can use it for battlefield deception or to influence law enforcement decision-making and many other things. So disinformation is really not just fake news. I hate that term. I think we should all stop using it. It can be used to alter the decision-making of humans and the decision-making of machines alike. I think Russia's already demonstrated a pretty good capability at being able to game algorithms, so we should be worried about this space moving forward. We should also think about how the Kremlin has been using digital illegals, deep cover, established false personas and movements online, especially like those used to influence the US elections. Where else can this type of operation be effective, especially if you mix it with the type of tactics that ISIS was using online? Can you create a movement, recruit online, build a proxy force, and then deploy it, all with total deniability as a foreign actor? Can you exploit the sentiment of targets to reorient them toward the objectives that you need to achieve? And I think there's a lot of wargaming we need to do in this area because the Kremlin has shown itself to be particularly willing to champion criminals and terrorist organizations when it's useful for them to do so. Ultimately, could you win and fight a war totally in the information space? And what would that look like? And what does it mean? The future of cyber operations, which have already been discussed, and attacks on critical infrastructure and communications will also be an important aspect of hybrid techniques. But the Kremlin will continue to use information operations and proxies and intelligence operations to stoke levels of violence and unrest in target countries that remain below the level of warfare, but above the level that I think law enforcement can safely handle, or which require the sustainment of a security posture that reinforces all the anti-government sentiments that the Kremlin's propaganda exploits so ably. They will try to demonstrate that NATO and the EU are just agreements that can collapse under the weight of nationalism and populism, and that our alliances mean less, which gives them the greater ability to influence the outcome of events moving forward. So I think Russian hybrid warfare really exposes that the Kremlin is working toward the advancement of a worldview that is cynical and atomized, and that is surprisingly effective in an environment of eroding belief in the ability of democracies to deliver to their own people. In this age of guerrillas, it's an age of cynicism. As long as these are the parameters they're operating under, the Kremlin has an advantage over the rest of us. So what do we do about it? Well, I think there's one place that we really need to start. Going back to the nonsensical debate about whether or not Gerasimov is doctrine, as opposed to whether or not this is how Russia projects power. Why don't we ever see Russia for what it is? It's not that Russia hasn't confronted its history. It's that Russians have no idea of the truth of their last century, or who they are, or who their families were, or whether they were victims or villains in that history, or how that separates or connects them to the rest of the world. It's not that Russia hasn't confronted its history, it's that none of the rest of us have either. We aren't very good at talking about the reality of the Soviet past. We aren't good at admitting that everything we in the West have done since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been done at least partially as penance for leaving millions of people enslaved to the Soviets for 50 years. We've never apologized to all the people that we bartered away, while we pretended that we knew nothing of the bodies in the gulags or of all the famines. In the Soviet Union, the prisoners in the camps were never liberated. There was never the moral clarity of victory over oppressor. Prisoners were let out and made their way home, and everyone was told not to bring it up again. And then the whole thing collapsed quietly and everybody moved on. There is this fabric of gulag love stories that remade the face of the entire region, that stands in direct opposition to the lies that we all tell ourselves about our World War II alliance with the Soviets and everything that came after. We don't see what Russia is now because we don't see it for what it was ever. And Putin's rewrite of history has masterfully presented this art of the dual identity, where Russians can be victim and hero both at the same time. It's time to remember there's nothing the Kremlin uses on its external opponents that it doesn't use on its own people first. Maybe the worst part of the future of hybrid warfare is going to be looking inward, back on Russia, as Putin tries to engineer whatever comes next at home. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Luke Harding. I'm I'm a journalist for The Guardian. I write books as well. It's been a busy couple of weeks. I was going to talk about collusion, Donald Trump, Russia, but that's now yesterday's news. Something else has happened. So instead, I thought I would talk about Sergei Skripal, which is the story I've been writing about. Thousands of words since Sergei, former GRU officer living quietly in the southwest of England, in Salisbury, a city where really nothing ever happens. And of course, as we know, he and his daughter Yulia were out and about the Sunday before last, 8 years after he went into exile and was officially pardoned by President Dmitry Medvedev. And they had a meal in a restaurant, they went for a drink, they parked in a car park, and really like something from a kind of horror film, the pair of them were spotted on a bench next to the River Avon, rather great river with trout in it. There was snow melting, and they were frothing, comatose, spasming. They looked out of it, according to eyewitnesses. Paramedics came on the scene, police came on the scene. They thought that they were perhaps drug addicts. The problem was they looked a bit too prosperous to be drug addicts. The grammar kind of didn't quite fit. They were taken away by ambulance. Oh, hello, I think this is a call from Putin now. What is that? I had actually turned my phone off, but I just like to... hello? And of course, now we know what happened, that they'd been attacked by persons unknown using a rare Soviet... he's ringing again. Let me just get rid of this. Can I give you that? Just take that. A rare Soviet nerve agent. I think, how do we interpret this extraordinary event? Well, first of all, it's pretty clear that the trail goes back to Moscow. That's not our kind of inference, but this was a kind of demonstrative crime. It was really a kind of a sign of, I would say, kind of contempt and arrogance, because it wasn't just Yulia and Sergei Skripal who were affected. That's their car, their BMW, but it was really a kind of terror attack, similar to one that on a smaller scale, but that David Sater was talking about earlier on. against the civilian population. We have a policeman in hospital still. We have a kind of population who are sort of terrified. I think what we can say about this is that, I mean, Skripal was not a terribly well-known defector. I mean, he was in the news, but there were other more kind of prominent targets. And I think in some ways he was more the instrument. And I think there were several targets from this operation. One of them is clearly Britain itself. I mean, the UK, my country, is friendless and lacking in allies at the moment. I'm not sure what the Trump-Theresa relationship is, but there was no swift tweet of solidarity from the US president. There was plenty of other stuff. I think Britain is geopolitically isolated, and that is one. The idea that actually the Russian special services can behave with impunity inside the UK. But I think the other target was, of course, the Russian domestic population. This attack happened 2 weeks before Sunday's presidential election. And it plays well. It's been dominating the media. We've had expulsions of Russian diplomats. There'll be some kind of response shortly from Vladimir Putin, which may be asymmetric. But there's a kind of dynamic of confrontation, of Russia under siege, of hostile Western conspiracy, which plays well and I think will galvanize some people to vote at a time of widespread apathy when the conclusion of Sunday's contest is already known. But I mean, I think the ultimate target of this operation, which was extremely nasty, was perhaps people inside the Russian special services, and I would say the elite more generally, who are thinking of cooperating with Western intelligence, and in particular Robert Mueller, the special counsel investigating collusion. And I think that the message is that if you do that, we can strike you. We will go after your family as well. And it's a very kind of chilling message. And of course, the other thing I would have to say is that we have been here before. We had the murder in 2006 of Alexander Litvinenko with a similarly esoteric substance, radioactive polonium-210. And I mention that case because I think it's quite important. I mean, we'll be discussing all day about journalists, human rights workers, other opponents of the Putin regime who have died in opaque circumstances, mainly in Russia, but also outside of Russia. And the Litvinenko case is important because we had a kind of, because it was out of Russia, we had a kind of a proper investigation by Scotland Yard, by the police, by the authorities. And we had a tremendous struggle by Marina Litvinenko, who's also had a busy 2 weeks, to try and get justice for her husband. And we had a public inquiry in London which reported back in January 2016 and concluded that not only had the FSB poisoned Litvinenko, but that Vladimir Putin himself had probably approved the operation. In other words, we have a head of state who uses his extensive spy organizations to kill people he personally doesn't like. And that is quite an extraordinary state of affairs. Now, that's the bench where Yulia and Sergei Skripal were sitting. And this is provincial England. I mean, this is not normal. I know things going on here are also not normal, but this is not normal. I just want to talk about this person here, who is Christopher Steele. Just to set the record straight, there's been a lot of, I think, Kremlin disinformation about Steele and Skripal. Skripal was not a source. He was not involved in the Trump dossier at all. But actually, what Steele has been doing over the last 30 years, and he's the kind of thread who runs through my book, is essentially been kind of investigating sort of Russian active measures, both in the Soviet period, which he watched. He was a junior diplomat at the Soviet embassy in Moscow from 1990 to 1993, and sort of subsequently. And what we've seen over the last sort of decade plus really is a kind of arc of aggressive behavior, of revanchism. I mean, we have these murders or attempted murders of Litvinenko and Skripal. We have, as other speakers have talked about, we have attempts to influence European elections. We have wars, we have annexation of territory. I covered the war in Georgia for The Guardian when I was based in Moscow between 2007 and 2011. I covered the conflict absolutely engineered by Moscow in Donbass in 2014. And Steele has been kind of working on all of this for a long time. And in 2016, he was given the assignment. He was actually just asked a fairly kind of simple question, which is, what is the relationship between Donald Trump and Russia, particularly in the field of business? And he sent this query out to a succession of secret sources and got, I mean, I know him pretty well, and he got what he describes as kind of hair-raising replies, essentially. He didn't know what the answers would be, but he believes, and he wrote in a series of field memoranda, kind of raw intelligence documents, which became the kind of Trump dossier, that there's a kind of transactional relationship going on between people in the Kremlin, between Putin, intermediated via oligarchs and other figures, and that Trump is kind of compromised. And what he did with this information was to go to the FBI, and he didn't do this because he was a political hack, because he was an activist, because he was a sort of deranged left-winger. He did it because he was concerned about democracy. He was concerned about what he viewed essentially as a kind of real-time espionage operation which was going on. And I think, I mean, he's had a torrid few weeks. It's extraordinary times, actually, and he's been under attack from senior Republicans. But I think he thinks that sort of quietly he is going to be vindicated. And what we've seen, years, months, weeks, kind of proves the thesis of hostile and aggressive measures being taken by Russia to try and essentially subvert Western democracy, to sow division, to instrumentalize the problems which are genuine and pre-exist in our society for Russia's kind of advantage. Meanwhile, while doing a kind of full-blown propaganda campaign to kind of confuse. And I think the way Putin talks about the dossier, the way he talks about Trump, the way he talks about Skripal, there's a kind of we didn't do it, followed by an enormous sort of wink, which everybody can see. And so much of this is in plain sight. So, I mean, I would conclude by saying that I think there's plenty we can do. I think Theresa May's response to Skripal has been relatively weak. I mean, she's kicked out 23 undeclared intelligence officers. She has said that Prince William will not be going to the World Cup. I do not think this is striking fear into the Lubyanka. The fact that the British sports minister will not be there when England are knocked out early in the tournaments will dismay no one in Russia. And I think we need to smarten up. We need to be more creative. The US has leverage, and I think the UK has leverage because, as we all perfectly understand, despite the kind of super patriotism of Putin and the people around him, that's the kind of noisy public project. The kind of private project that they care about is the 250, 350 billion that they've stolen, and really their main goal is to preserve that wealth, to offshore that wealth, and to safeguard it from predatory attack from other people inside the elite. So this is the dynamic. And so there are things that we can do in terms of oligarchs, in terms of de-visaing Kremlin officials and their kids who want to come to London. But just to kind of wrap up, I would say we shouldn't be demoralized. I think we should be actually almost in celebratory mood today because there are plenty of reasons to be optimistic. Russia is a great country. Russia is not Putin. There are wonderful Russians here in the audience and in Russia who deserve better than the dismal regime that they have at the moment. And I think with your help, with people like Steele, with journalists, with engaged citizens, I think we can shine light on dark times. Thank you.
This concludes the second session. Lunch is being served in the lobby. During the break, we encourage you to visit the area next to Kirchick. We have just set up an interactive art exhibit that is worth seeing. At 12:40 in the theater, there will be a special presentation. Please note that no food is allowed in the theater.